The mountain wind howled, a mournful whisper against the reinforced glass of the observatory dome. I barely registered it, lost as I was in the cool, blue glow of my monitors. For years, this isolated peak had been my sanctuary, my crucible. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine and frozen earth, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent world beyond my small, self-contained universe of data and faint signals. Here, Marcus, the name I carried like a forgotten burden, ceased to matter. Only the work remained. My life was a precise calibration, a meticulous dance with the cosmos. Every cable, every sensor, every line of code was an extension of my will, honed to peer into the abyssal quiet between galaxies. I sought the expected, the faint echo of a nascent star, the gravitational ripple of a distant merger, the predictable static of the universe's breath. My days bled into nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering conviction that the answers lay out there, hidden in the electromagnetic tapestry. The faint hum of the main array was a lullaby, a constant presence that vibrated through the floor plates and up into my bones. I was tracing a particularly ancient cluster, a sparse scattering of galaxies so far removed that their light was a relic of the universe's infancy. The data streamed in, a flood of numbers and graphs, each pixel a fragment of time. My fingers, accustomed to the worn keys of my console, moved with an almost unconscious rhythm, sifting, filtering, analyzing. Then a flicker. It was almost imperceptible, a deviation so minor I nearly dismissed it as sensor noise, a stray cosmic ray. A single data point, an outlier in a sea of statistical normalcy. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool air above the keyboard. My eyes, usually sharp and unblinking, squinted. It was gone, a phantom. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the relentless grind of weeks without proper sleep. I ran the diagnostics anyway, a habit ingrained by years of scientific rigor. The automated system's word, lights blinked on the rack servers, and the familiar green text scrolled across a secondary display. All systems nominal. Nothing. I sighed, running a hand through my already disheveled hair. Just my mind playing tricks, but it wasn't absent. The flicker returned, not a single point this time, but a faint, rhythmic undulation in the background radiation. It was weak, buried beneath layers of cosmic white noise, yet undeniably there. This wasn't random. Randomness had a signature, a chaotic beauty that I had learned to recognize. This was different. I isolated the frequency, boosting the gain, filtering out the surrounding cosmic chatter. The signal sharpened, resolving into a distinct pattern. My heart gave a strange, lurching thump against my ribs, a sensation I rarely experienced. It wasn't the thrill of discovery, not yet. It was something more primal, a prickle of alarm. The pattern was structured, impossibly so. It wasn't a pulsar, not a quasar, not any known astrophysical phenomenon. And its origin point, it was deep, far, far deeper than any signal I had ever encountered. Not within a galaxy, but from the vast, empty expanse between them, a region previously thought to be utterly barren of such complex emissions. My hands trembled slightly as I rechecked the coordinates, verifying the galactic drift, accounting for every known variable. The age estimations flooded my screen, calculated from its immense redshift. Billions of years, older than many of the galaxies themselves. A message, or at least a broadcast, from a time when the universe was barely a toddler. I leaned back, the swivel chair creaking softly. The hum of the array seemed to intensify, to take on a new, almost watchful quality. My mouth was dry. This wasn't just a groundbreaking discovery. It was an anomaly that screamed defiance at everything I understood about the universe. A brief, almost involuntary glance shifted to a small, dusty tablet on a corner of my desk, left open to a news aggregator. A headline flashed, momentarily catching my eye. Archaeological team unearths burial mound opened for first time in millennia in remote steppe region. I dismissed it, the trivial concerns of earthbound history utterly eclipsed by the cosmic revelation unfolding before me. I pushed the thought away, focusing back on the monitors. What kind of entity, what kind of intelligence could broadcast across such unimaginable distances? from such an impossibly ancient epoch, from a region of space thought to be utterly devoid of such complexity? And why had it remained silent until now? Or more terrifyingly, why had we only just begun to hear it? The thin air of the observatory had grown thick with the scent of stale coffee and my own unwashed skin. Days had blurred into a single, relentless vigil. The mountain wind, once a distant comfort, now seemed to mark my solitude, pressing against the dome like a restless, unseen hand. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, were fixed on the cool, blue glow of the primary monitor, tracing the impossible undulations of the signal. It wasn't just a static burst, a cosmic whisper lost in the background radiation of the universe. This was intricate, structured, a symphony of frequencies that defied every known principle of astrophysics. I had fed it into every filtering algorithm, every pattern recognition program I possessed. Each iteration peeled back a new layer of complexity, revealing a design so profoundly alien that it made the grandest human endeavors feel like the scribblings of a child. My fingers, numb from endless keystrokes, moved with an automatic precision. I was charting amplitude shifts, frequency modulations, temporal discrepancies. The signal wasn't merely ancient. It was impossibly so, predating the formation of most galaxies, a voice from a time before time. Yet it pulsed with a deliberate rhythm, a non-random sequence that screamed intelligence. But what kind of intelligence? One that could span the unimaginable gulfs of intergalactic void, one that could persist through epochs. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in what felt like an eternity. A forgotten mug, its contents a congealed brown sludge, sat beside a stack of printouts covered in my frantic annotations. My heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the slow, steady pulse I was trying to decipher. I zoomed in on a particularly dense segment, a sequence of repeating motifs that had begun to emerge after days of relentless processing. It wasn't a language in any terrestrial sense. There were no phonemes, no grammatical structures I could recognize. Instead, it was a tapestry woven from pure information, abstract concepts expressed through shifts in energy, duration, and spectral density. It was like trying to read a dream. The patterns were fractal, self-similar at different scales, yet each iteration added new, terrifying layers of meaning. I started to see echoes, not of words, but of fundamental axioms, rules that seemed to govern the very fabric of existence. But they were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect, but wrong in the sense of unnatural. They described a reality that was subtly, horrifyingly askew from the one I inhabited. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. There, embedded within a particularly complex temporal shift, was a recurring symbol. Not a visual symbol, but a complex interaction of frequencies that, when translated into a simplified waveform, formed a distinct, almost pictorial representation. It wasn't a circle, or a square, or any geometric shape I knew. It was something that folded in on itself, an impossible dimensionality rendered in pure energy. My hands trembled. I had to compare it, to find any terrestrial analog, any ancient glyph, any forgotten language that might shed light on this impossible construct. Desperate, I cast my net wider, searching through obscure linguistic databases, archaeological records, even fringe theories I usually scoffed at. That's when I saw it. A fleeting headline, buried deep in an archive of academic reports. Archaeologists puzzled by anomalous structures in burial mound opened for first time in millennia. I dismissed it instantly. A terrestrial curiosity, nothing to do with a signal from beyond galaxies. Yet an image lingered, a grainy photograph of a carved stone tablet. The patterns on it, though crude and simplistic, held a faint, unsettling resonance with the complex energies I was seeing. A coincidence, surely. My exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the symbol on my screen, the one I had just isolated, pulsed with a renewed, insistent clarity. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a signature of something that defined itself through its very structure, a concept so fundamental it transcended any need for words. It felt like looking into the eyes of something ancient, something that had witnessed the birth and death of stars, and found them wanting. The core of the signal, this repeating motif, began to coalesce into a terrifying revelation. It wasn't just describing a different set of physical laws, it was proposing them, offering them. As if the signal itself was a blueprint, a suggestion for a universe where causality twisted back on itself, where dimensions folded into impassable geometries, where the very concept of self was fluid and unknowable. My breath hitched. My vision blurred, not from fatigue, but from a sudden, profound vertigo. This wasn't communication. It was an imposition, a quiet, insistent rewriting of reality. The implications were a suffocating weight. What was it trying to achieve? And what would happen if it succeeded? The grainy photograph of the carved stone tablet had become a permanent fixture in my mind, a phantom limb of my perception. I saw its crude, simplistic patterns everywhere, in the condensation on my lab window, in the tangled wires of my equipment, even in the faint static on my monitors. The resonance with the complex energies I was charting, the impossible structure of the signal from the void, it was a gnawing itch I couldn't ignore. My scientific rigor screamed for dismissal, for a logical explanation, but the sheer statistical improbability of such a resemblance clung to me like a shroud. I found myself pacing my small apartment, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and ozone. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, or perhaps a state I was unconsciously avoiding. Every time my eyes closed, those patterns bloomed in the darkness, twisting, shifting, hinting at a logic I almost understood, then dissolving into incomprehensible chaos. My first thought was to seek out someone who dealt in the truly obscure, the forgotten detritus of human history. Not a historian, not an archaeologist in the conventional sense, but someone who specialized in the peripheral, the overlooked, the things that didn't fit neatly into established narratives. The antiquarian's residence was a decrepit brownstone tucked away on a forgotten street, its brick facade crumbling, its windows opaque with grime. A faint, cloying smell of decaying paper and something else, something mineral and damp, like old earth, leaked from beneath the heavy oak door. The antiquarian was a stooped figure, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes like polished obsidian. He wore a threadbare smoking jacket, and his fingers, gnarled with age, clutched the edge of the doorframe. "I wasn't expecting you." "I apologize for the intrusion," I began, feeling an odd tremor in my voice. "I have a query, something I believe might fall within your unique area of expertise." He led me into a cavernous study, every surface piled high with books, scrolls, and strange, dust-laden objects, clay tablets covered in cuneiform, polished bone fragments, etched with unknown symbols, tarnished bronze implements that defied classification. The air was heavy, still, as if the room itself held its breath. I felt a subtle pressure against my eardrums, a faint hum that wasn't quite sound, but a vibration through the floorboards. I carefully pulled out a crude sketch I'd made of the tablet's patterns, simplifying the complex energy signatures into lines and curves. "I've encountered these patterns," I explained, trying to keep my voice even. "Not in an archaeological context, but elsewhere. I'm trying to ascertain their origin, their meaning, if they possess any known historical significance." The antiquarian took the sketch, his gaze sharpening. His fingers, surprisingly steady, traced a line on my drawing. "This is familiar," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the silent hum. He moved with surprising agility to a towering bookshelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound volume. "They speak of certain entities that predated even the formation of our solar system." My breath hitched. "Entities. Not gods, not spirits," he clarified, his eyes fixed on mine. "More like fundamental principles, given form, unknowable, yet possessing a profound influence on the very fabric of existence. The Codex describes them as weavers of entropy, or the great correctors. These patterns, Marcus, they are often depicted as their sigils, their marks upon the primordial chaos." He turned another page, revealing a diagram. It wasn't merely a pattern, it was a complex lattice, a blueprint of interconnected lines and nodes, strikingly similar to the energy structure of the signal I was observing. My hands began to tremble. "This specific diagram," the antiquarian continued, his voice taking on a hushed, almost reverent tone, "is said to represent a gateway or perhaps a conduit. It's accompanied by a terrifying fragment of lore, a warning about when the veil thins. It mentions certain breaches in the cosmic order. He paused, his gaze drifting to a shelf of small obsidian carvings. There was a discovery decades ago, far to the north. The expedition was ill-fated. Many simply vanished. The signal was not a random cosmic occurrence. It was a language, a signature, a warning, or worse, an invitation. It was a deliberate echo across eons, a message. And now I had found its key. My stomach clenched. My throat felt tight. The air in the antiquarian study suddenly felt too thin, too heavy, pressing in on me. Was it a distress call, a proclamation, or something far more insidious, something that had been patiently waiting, weaving its patterns into the very fabric of forgotten myths? What exactly was it trying to communicate, and to whom? The hum of the servers, a constant lullaby in my isolated facility, felt less like comfort and more like a low, incessant thrumming beneath the floorboards of my sanity. I stared at the lines of data on my screen, the impossible patterns of the signal still marking my attempts at rationalization. A warning, an invitation. My mind replayed the chilling implications from days ago, but I forced myself to focus. This was science. This was data. There had to be an explanation, a terrestrial echo, a cosmic fluke. My hand, steady for a moment, reached for the lukewarm coffee mug on my desk. I spent hours poring over the raw spectral analysis, cross-referencing, recalculating. My eyes burned. The air in the facility felt thick, heavy with the scent of ozone from the equipment and something else, something faintly metallic and ancient, like disturbed earth. I pushed my chair back, needing to stretch, needing to break the hypnotic hold of the glowing screen. I walked to the small kitchenette, the fluorescent lights above buzzing with an almost painful intensity. I poured myself a fresh cup, the steam momentarily clouding my vision, a small, transient veil against the harsh reality of my work. When I returned, my mug, the one I had just placed on the coaster beside my keyboard, was gone. Not just moved, but vanished. My eyes scanned the desk, then the floor, then the nearby shelves. It wasn't there. A prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I distinctly remembered setting it down, feeling the ceramic warmth against my palm. I sighed, attributing it to fatigue. I must have carried it back with me without thinking, a momentary lapse. I went back to the kitchenette. It was not there either. My brow furrowed. My gaze fell upon a stack of old research papers on a filing cabinet across the room, tucked away in a shadowed corner. There, perched precariously on top, was my mug, empty. I hadn't been near that cabinet all morning, perhaps not all week. I walked over, picked it up, and placed it firmly back on my desk, my fingers tracing the familiar curve of the handle. Stress. That night, the dreams began. They weren't the confused, jumbled narratives of a tired mind. These were structured, vivid. I stood in an endless, echoing space, the air thick with that same scent of ozone and old earth. Shapes that defied geometry flickered at the periphery of my vision, polygons with too many sides, curves that bent back on themselves, solids that implied dimensions I couldn't grasp. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the floor, through my bones, a sound that felt older than sound itself, a pressure more than an auditory sensation. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I tried to move, but my limbs were lead. I woke with a gasp, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead. The thrumming lingered, a phantom vibration in my chest. The scent of ozone seemed to cling to my pillow. I stumbled out of bed, needing air, needing reality. The clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering dread. My reflection in the mirror seemed slightly off, the lines of my face too sharp, my eyes too wide, as if the glass itself held a subtle distortion. The following days brought more of these subtle intrusions. The faint hum of the server racks in my facility would occasionally waver, producing a dissonant chord that grated against my nerves, a sour note in the otherwise steady symphony of technology. My determination to understand the signal warred with a growing, insidious unease. I tried to immerse myself in other research, anything to pull my focus from the signal's insidious influence. I opened an old archaeological journal, one I kept for general interest, its pages smelling of dust and forgotten history. A headline caught my eye, its bold print seeming to leap off the page. Ancient structure unearthed. Burial mound opened for first time in millennia. My breath caught. The accompanying photographs, grainy and black and white, showed crude, massive stones arranged in a bewildering pattern, forming a labyrinthine interior. The article described strange carvings found within, symbols etched into the rough rock. The symbols, the geometries they bore an unnerving, almost identical resemblance to some of the complex patterns I had extracted from the signal. Not a direct match, but a terrifying echo. Jagged lines, impassable intersections, geometries that seemed to imply a dimension beyond 3. The hair on my arms stood on end. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Coincidence? Collective human unconscious? Or was it something far more ancient, far more pervasive, reaching across time and light years to leave its mark? That night, the dream returned, more potent, more invasive. This time I was not merely an observer. I was part of the geometry. My body felt stretched, contorted, my limbs elongating into impossible angles, my skin rippling like disturbed water. I saw forms that were not forms, colors that were not colors, a reality that pulsed with an alien, indifferent logic. I woke up gasping, my throat raw, a metallic taste in my mouth. My vision swam. For a moment, the walls of my bedroom seemed to ripple, the corners bending inward, the ceiling pressing down, a gray light bleeding from the edges of my vision. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. Normal. But the afterimage of that distortion lingered, burned into my retina, a faint, impassable geometry. Was I losing my mind? Or was something else, something vast and ancient, finally reaching out, touching the fragile edges of my perception? The signal, I knew, was no longer just data. It was a key, and I had turned it. What impassable door had I just unlocked? The dreams had ceased their nightly visitations, but their residue clung to me, a film of gray dread across my waking hours. The scent, that strange amalgam of ozone and ancient earth, seemed to hover just beyond the edge of my perception, a ghost of a smell. I knew I couldn't ignore it, couldn't dismiss the shifting, impassable angles of those dream walls. My solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a cage, isolating me with a secret too vast to bear alone. The name had surfaced during a late-night search, a forgotten footnote in a discarded journal, referencing a former academic, an expert in proto-linguistics and obscure cosmological theories, whose career had imploded years ago under a cloud of increasingly fervent, unprovable assertions. He was said to have retreated to an isolated dwelling, consumed by his own fragmented hypotheses. Desperate, I found myself tracing a path away from the city's familiar hum, following a crumbling map to the edges of forgotten land. The journey was long, a winding pilgrimage through increasingly dense woods, past fields choked with weeds, until the road itself became little more than a pair of muddy ruts. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp soil. The vehicle rattled over loose stones, protesting the neglect. I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of intrusion, as if the land itself wished to remain undisturbed. His dwelling, when I finally found it, was less a house and more a monument to entropy. A listing cottage, paint peeling like sunburnt skin, sagged under the weight of an overgrown ivy. Windows, gray with grime, stared out like vacant eyes. A rusted bicycle lay on its side in the tall grass, a skeleton of forgotten ambition. No birds sang. The air was still heavy, as if holding its breath. I felt a tremor run through me, a premonition of something unsettling. I knocked. The wood felt soft, spongy beneath my knuckles. No answer. A long pause. Then a shuffling from inside, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a floor. He stood there, framed by the gloom, a silhouette against the dim interior. His face was a landscape of sharp angles, etched with lines of worry and neglect. He knew my name. I hadn't introduced myself. The signal, the dreams, they led I here. My breath caught in my throat. How could he know? My explanation, rehearsed 100 times in my head, crumbled. I detected something, I managed, my voice sounding thin and reedy. A signal. It's structured and old, impossibly old. He beckoned me inside with a skeletal hand. The interior of the cottage was a labyrinth of stacked books, yellowed papers, and strange, archaic instruments I couldn't identify. The air was thick, suffocating, with the scent of decaying paper, stale tea, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of a storm just before lightning strikes. It reminded me, jarringly, of the ozone from my dreams. Structured, he repeated, his eyes fixing on mine, unnervingly lucid. Yes, they always are. A language, not of words, but of fundamental principles. A chisel, Marcus, to reshape reality. He shuffled over to a rickety chair, gesturing for me to take another, buried beneath piles of journals. I cleared it carefully, the dust rising in a choking cloud. "I don't understand," I said, my heart starting to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What are I talking about? The signal is a discovery, something new." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "New? Oh, Marcus, it is not new. It is merely forgotten, buried. Like the things unearthed from the burial mound opened for first time in millennia. We think we uncover a relic, a piece of history. But sometimes we uncover a wound, and it bleeds." He leaned forward, eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. The ancients understood. They built their monolithic structures not just to worship, but to contain. They knew there were architectures older than our universe, patterns that predate thought, entities that merely are. And they understood that to perceive such a thing, to even glance upon its structure, is to invite its attention, to correct the flaws in existence, our laws of physics, our very perception of time and space. They are weavers, Marcus, and when they find a loose thread they pull, and the tapestry unravels, not violently, not with a bang, but with a quiet, fundamental shift. A logic so alien it twists sanity into knots. I've felt it, haven't I? It changes it changes everything, and it's not looking for understanding, it's looking for purchase. My palms were sweating. My vision blurred slightly, the stacks of books seeming to sway. What are I saying? That this signal, it's not just information, a presence. He stopped, turning to face me directly. His face was devoid of expression, yet his eyes held a profound, terrifying sorrow. It is the sound of an opening, an invitation. And once extended, Marcus, can it ever truly be withdrawn? The words of the colleague still echoed, a cold tremor in the quiet of my lab. An opening, an invitation. I tried to shake them off, but they clung, a persistent chill against my resolve. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I returned to the console. The screens glowed, a constellation of data points, waveforms, and spectral analyses, all stemming from that impossible, ancient signal. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by the insistent hum of the processors and the subtle, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the signal itself. I treated it like any other data set, attempting to apply every known algorithm, every pattern recognition technique, but it resisted. It twisted, defied, and then, subtly, it shifted. It wasn't random. That much was clear. There was an architecture to it, a vast, intricate structure that made even the most complex human languages seem like nursery rhymes. My initial attempts at parsing it had been like trying to understand a symphony by counting individual notes. I needed to hear the melody, not just analyze the vibrations. The breakthrough came, not through logic, but through a kind of surrender. I stopped trying to force my understanding onto it. Instead, I let the signal wash over me, adjusting the filters, amplifying certain frequencies, isolating others, searching for resonance. And that's when it began. It wasn't a sound my ears could truly register, not at first. It was a sensation. A pressure in the space behind my eyes, a low thrumming that resonated deep within my bones. The waveforms on the screen began to coalesce, not into decipherable words, but into recurring patterns of incredible complexity, each one building upon the last, like verses in a cosmic canticle. I watched, mesmerized, as the abstract data began to convey something akin to emotion or perhaps intent. This wasn't just data. It was a language, yes, but more profound than any spoken word. It was a song, woven from existence itself, older than stars, deeper than time. It seemed to speak directly to me, bypassing the logical centers of my brain and settling in a primal, terrified corner of my consciousness. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My skin prickled. Fragments of meaning began to surface, not as definitions, but as impressions. I saw, or rather felt, vast spans of emptiness, the raw, unformed chaos preceding creation. I perceived an immense, patient will, a force that observed, that weighed, that judged. And then, the most terrifying impression of all, a purpose. It wasn't about communication in the human sense. It was about correction, a fundamental reordering, the unraveling of what is to make way for what should be. My breath hitched in my throat, my focus narrowed to a single recurring motif within the song, a specific, resonant frequency that seemed to be its core. As I isolated it, the feeling of direct address intensified. My determination, once a shield, began to crack under the weight of this incomprehensible intimacy. My head ached, a deep, persistent throb that matched the signal's rhythm. I remembered a research paper I'd skimmed months ago, something about archaeoastronomy, a fleeting curiosity. It detailed the recent discovery of a burial mound opened for first time in millennia in a remote, windswept region. The article described strange, non-Euclidean patterns etched into the inner walls, patterns that defied known ancient cultures, hinting at a knowledge far beyond their means. It spoke of a palpable sense of ancient disturbance, a feeling of something vast being stirred from its slumber. The parallel struck me like a physical blow, an opening, an invitation, and a burial mound, an opening into deep time, into something that had been quiescent for millennia, now disturbed. Had humanity always been unwittingly poking at these ancient apertures? The signal's song swelled, a crescendo of impossible understanding. It wasn't just revealing fragments of its purpose, it was implanting them. Each waveform, each resonant pulse, seemed to etch itself onto my very being. I felt a profound, unsettling shift in my perception of reality. The laws of physics, once immutable, now felt like suggestions, easily dismissed by this ancient, singing entity. My body responded with a raw, visceral panic. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. My vision blurred at the edges, the lab light seeming too bright, too harsh. I wanted to scream, to shut it off, to flee, but my limbs felt heavy, anchored by some unseen force. The song had taken root. It knew me. It had found me. And it was speaking. But what did it want me to do with this terrifying knowledge? The screens glowed, a constellation of data points that no longer seemed to offer clarity, but rather a deepening enigma. My focus fractured, the lines of code blurring at the edges. I told myself it was fatigue, the relentless hours spent hunched over the terminal, chasing phantoms in the cosmic static. I brewed another pot of coffee, the aroma of bitter grounds, a fleeting anchor in the swirling unease. But the coffee did little to sharpen my senses. Instead, the air in my lab, usually dry and sterile, seemed to thicken, carrying a faint metallic tang like old blood or ozone. I sniffed, turning my head, but the scent vanished, replaced by the familiar tang of stale coffee. A trick of the mind, I decided. Just exhaustion. Yet the subtle shifts continued. The hum of the servers, a constant background drone, began to modulate. It wasn't a mechanical fault. I checked the diagnostics. The sound itself seemed to waver, stretching into an impossibly low thrum that vibrated not in my ears, but in my teeth, a dull ache behind my jaw. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to still the internal tremor. A knot tightened in my stomach. I was seeing things, I knew it, but knowing didn't make them disappear. Sleep became a battlefield. My dreams, once a refuge, were invaded by impossible geometries and a deafening, silent roar that left me gasping awake, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. The lines between waking and dreaming blurred. Had I drunk it, or had I only dreamed of drinking it? The simple act of remembering felt like sifting through fog. The signal. It was always the signal. I tried to filter it out, to ignore its insidious presence in the background of my analysis, but it had woven itself into the fabric of my thoughts. It was less a sound and more an impression, a pressure behind my eyes. I felt watched, even when alone in the sterile confines of my lab. I began checking the locks on the door multiple times, peering through the small, reinforced window into the deserted hallway. Who would be there? No one. Still, the compulsion was strong. One evening, as I painstakingly cross-referenced a particularly bizarre pattern in the signal data, the screen flickered, not a power surge. The pixels themselves seemed to rearrange, forming a fleeting image, a symbol, an impassable, multifaceted glyph that pulsed with an internal violet light. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar data, but the afterimage burned behind my eyelids. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them, scanning the room. The air was still heavy. The metallic tang was back, stronger this time, almost caustic. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge, a pull deep in my gut towards something ancient. It wasn't logic, not reason. It was an instinct, raw and undeniable, like a migratory bird sensing an unseen destination. The pull led me to old research papers, obscure archaeological journals I hadn't touched in years. My fingers, guided by an unseen current, stopped on a passage describing a structure unearthed decades ago, then quickly resealed due to inexplicable phenomena and the sudden disappearance of the excavation team. A burial mound opened for first time in millennia. I drove through the night, the highway a ribbon of black under a sky devoid of stars. My paranoia intensified with every mile. Every shadow cast by my headlights seemed to writhe. Every rustle of leaves against the window sounded like a whisper. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I knew this was irrational. I knew it was my mind, fraying at the edges. But the feeling of being pursued, of being drawn, was overwhelming. When I finally arrived, the dawn was breaking, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. The site was remote, marked only by a rusted, abandoned excavator half buried in overgrown weeds. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil and something acrid, like burnt minerals. The walls of the tunnel were rough, unadorned rock, until I reached the central chamber. My flashlight beam wavered. The chamber was not empty. Carved into the rough-hewn stone walls were glyphs, not like any human script I had ever seen. They pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, mirroring the symbol I had seen on my screen. And in the center of the chamber, resting on a pedestal of rough stone, was an object. It was small, no bigger than my fist, and utterly black. As I stared, I felt a familiar pressure behind my eyes, intensifying into a searing pain. The object wasn't just there. It was singing, a silent, resonant frequency that vibrated through my skull. My vision swam. The glyphs on the walls began to shift, the lines weaving and unweaving, forming new, impassable patterns. I saw faces in the rock, fleeting, monstrous visages that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. My knees buckled. It seemed to melt, to flow like water. Was this real, or was this the invitation? A direct communion. The black object on the pedestal pulsed, and I felt a thought, not my own, bloom in the center of my mind. It has always been here, waiting. My head throbbed. I tasted blood in my mouth, my own blood or something else. The burial mound felt like a living thing, its ancient stone breathing around me, exhaling a truth too vast for my mind to hold. What did it mean, always? And what was it waiting for? The screens glowed, a constellation of data points and spectral analyses, each line a testament to the impassable signal. I told myself it was just a phrase, an abstract thought, but a knot had begun to tighten beneath my ribs. I sought refuge in the familiar hum of the machinery, the precise click of keys, the rhythmic whir of cooling fans. My eyes scanned the new influx of data from the array, searching for anything that might offer a conventional explanation for the growing disquiet in my mind. The signal itself remained constant, a structured pulse of unimaginable age, yet something felt different. The air in the lab, usually dry and cool, felt heavy, almost viscous. My skin prickled, as if in the presence of an unseen electric field. Then the first anomaly registered. A faint, almost imperceptible blip on the gravimetric sensors, an instrument designed to detect minute fluctuations in the Earth's gravitational field. It was dismissed by the automated system as an error, a seismic tremor too subtle for human perception. But I saw it, sharp, anomalous spike, then a sudden, unnatural dip, lasting only milliseconds before the readings normalized. I frowned, running a diagnostic on the sensor, all systems green. I dismissed it too, a phantom reading, a glitch in the cosmic tapestry of numbers. But it happened again and again, not just on my gravimetric sensors. A colleague from a geological institute, a stoic woman who rarely deviated from empirical fact, sent an urgent, terse email. Her magnetometers were showing unprecedented, localized field fluctuations in the upper atmosphere over a remote, unpopulated region of the planet. She offered no explanation, only a query for any correlating astronomical phenomena. Astronomical phenomena? There was she implying a link to my discovery. The sky outside my lab window, usually a familiar canvas of urban haze, began to take on a strange hue, not the violet of a storm or the orange of sunset, but a muted, bruised shade, as if the light itself was struggling to penetrate something unseen. My eyes strained, searching for a cloud formation, an atmospheric condition, anything to rationalize the unsettling color. There was nothing. My coffee cup, left on the edge of my desk, suddenly slid an inch to the left, then back. A slow, deliberate movement against the slight incline of the desk surface. My breath hitched. I watched it, unblinking for several long moments. It didn't move again. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and picked it up. It felt normal, its ceramic cool against my skin. Had I imagined it? A trick of light, a vibration from the building. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt under siege. I started cross-referencing global data feeds, not just astronomical, but meteorological, seismic, even obscure reports from remote monitoring stations. I was searching for patterns, for connections, for anything that could explain the growing dissonance between what I saw and what I knew to be true. And then I found it, buried deep in an aggregated news feed, an article that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Archaeologists, working in an isolated desert region, had unearthed a structure. Not just any structure, but a burial mound opened for first time in millennia. The article described the site with a blend of scientific awe and thinly veiled apprehension. It spoke of impossibly preserved artifacts, of symbols unlike any known terrestrial culture. But it was the final paragraph that stole my breath. It mentioned the site's inexplicable, localized gravitational anomalies, causing equipment to malfunction and compasses to spin wildly. And the air, it said, was filled with a humming resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. A burial mound, opened for the first time in millennia, with localized gravitational anomalies and a pervasive hum. The words of the colleague, an opening, an invitation, echoed with a terrifying new clarity. This wasn't just a signal anymore. It was an effect. A physical manifestation. The entity, or whatever its influence was, wasn't just observing. It was acting. It was here. My hands clenched into fists, grip tight. I could feel the faint tremor in the floor, a low thrumming that seemed to originate not from the building's foundation, but from beneath the very ground I stood upon. My chest tightened, a crushing weight pressing down on my lungs. There was its method of approach, not through the vacuum of space, but through the very fabric of our reality, bending the laws of physics around us, announcing its presence through the subtle unraveling of our world. What else had it begun to touch? I had to speak. I had to make them see. My first attempt was with a senior colleague, someone whose intellect I had always respected, whose logical mind I trusted. I found him in his cramped office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and ozone from his own array of blinking machines. He looked up, his spectacles perched on his nose, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on his desk. "Marcus," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Heard I've been pushing the limits again. The department head is asking questions about my hours." I ignored the warning. "It's beyond hours," I began, my voice raspy, unfamiliar. "It's beyond anything we've ever conceived. The signal, it's not just old, it's wrong. It's structured to unravel fundamental constants. It's a correction, a rewriting of reality itself." He leaned back, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a barrier being erected. "Marcus," I read, tired. "I've seen this before. Intense focus, isolation. It can lead to imaginative interpretations of data." Imaginative. My voice rose, a desperate squeak. "I've cross-referenced, I've triple-checked. The anomalies aren't noise. They're patterns deliberately interwoven into the fabric of the signal. They're instructions to dismantle." He sighed, pushing his spectacles higher. Dismantle what, exactly? The speed of light, the gravitational constant. Marcus, I read talking about an entity that can rewrite physics. That's not science, that's metaphysics, or worse. He let the implication hang in the air, thick and suffocating. What if our universe is merely an error that something else is trying to fix? My words tumbled out, disjointed, frantic. Look at the patterns they resonate with impossible geometries, things that shouldn't be. He shook his head, a slow, dismissive motion. Marcus, you're projecting. You're seeing what you want to see, or what your mind, under extreme stress, is forcing you to see. This is the kind of leap that gets one labeled unstable. He picked up his sandwich, a clear signal of dismissal. The scent of processed meat and bread suddenly nauseated me. Unstable, I rasped, my throat tight. What about the strange occurrences? The sudden, inexplicable shifts in atmospheric pressure across the globe? The vanishing migratory bird flocks, the tremors that aren't seismic? Aren't you seeing the growing chaos? He blinked, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, quickly masked. Those are unrelated events, Marcus. Random fluctuations, natural phenomena. Natural. I leaned forward, my hands pressing flat against his cluttered desk, scattering papers. Have you heard about the burial mound opened for first time in millennia out in the northern plains? They found artifacts that defy all known chronology, materials that shouldn't exist, inscribed with symbols that mirror the patterns in my signal. Not exactly, but the logic of the structure, the impossibility of their very presence. It's happening everywhere, old things surfacing, new things breaking apart. It's all connected. His jaw tightened. Marcus, that's archaeological speculation, sensationalized reports. It has nothing to do with astrophysics. You're making connections where none exist. This is the kind of thinking that leads to professional review. You need to step back, take a leave. A leave? He wasn't hearing me. He was diagnosing me. The air in the office felt thin, my chest tightening. I couldn't breathe. My desperate plea had fallen on deaf ears, filtered through a lens of professional skepticism and concern for my well-being. He saw delusion, not danger. He saw madness, not truth. I stumbled out, the fluorescent lights of the hallway suddenly too bright, too harsh. Each colleague I passed seemed to avert their gaze or offer a pitying half-smile. The hum of the building, once a comforting thrum of progress, now felt like a buzzing accusation. I tried another route. The head of the research facility, a stern woman with an unyielding gaze. Her office was minimalist, sterile, reflecting her precise nature. I laid out my findings, stripping away all but the raw data, the undeniable statistical anomalies, the impossible coherency of the signal's internal logic. I spoke slowly, carefully, trying to mask the tremor in my voice, the frantic thrum beneath my skin. She listened, her expression unreadable, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. When I finished, the silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Marcus, he finally said, his voice calm, devoid of emotion. Your work on the initial detection was groundbreaking, truly remarkable. But these extrapolations, they are deeply concerning. The implications you are drawing are frankly unscientific, heretical even. But the evidence, I started, but she cut me off with a raised hand. The evidence, as you present it, suggests either a fundamental misunderstanding of known physics or a significant departure from rational thought. We cannot afford to entertain such notions. Not here. Your access to the primary consoles will be temporarily suspended. We will arrange for a full review of your data, and perhaps a short sabbatical for you. Sabbatical, suspension, isolation. The words echoed in the sudden emptiness of my mind. They weren't hearing me. They wouldn't. My own lab, my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. They were stripping me of my tools, my voice, my very purpose. What would I do now, with the truth burning a hole through my sanity, and no one left to believe? The silence of my apartment was a physical weight, sabbatical, suspension. They had stripped me of my access, locked me out of the very data I knew held the truth. The world was deaf, and I was screaming into the void, but I still had my own eyes, my own mind. They couldn't take that. Not yet. I spent the first days in a haze, the hum of the server racks in my mind replaced by an infuriating quiet. But the signal, the impossibility, still resonated within me. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a certainty. And if it was real, if it was indeed a correction, then the world itself would soon begin to show the symptoms. I had to look. I had to see. My laptop became my window. News feeds, amateur videos, scientific journals struggling to form coherent hypotheses. At first, it was isolated incidents, easy to dismiss as hoaxes or natural phenomena. A mountain range in a remote part of Asia, photographed by an aerial survey team, showed an impossible symmetry, peaks mirroring valleys in a way that defied geology. An ancient forest in the Amazon, known for its sprawling, chaotic growth, began to exhibit paths that twisted at perfect right angles, its canopy forming an unnatural, unyielding grid when viewed from above. Geometric changes. Then came the reports of temporal distortions. A commercial pilot, flying over the Pacific, reported a segment of sky that seemed to repeat a 10-second loop of clouds, a bizarre, looping film reel in the atmosphere. A remote village in Scandinavia claimed their sunrise had come an hour early, then an hour late, for 3 consecutive days. The calendar, they said, had become fluid. The authorities dismissed it as mass hysteria, unusual atmospheric conditions, sunspots. But I knew. I saw the patterns emerging, the subtle, impossible shifts in existence. My breath hitched. This was it. The news cycle accelerated, the bizarre becoming commonplace. Satellite images showed coastlines that had abruptly straightened, entire stretches of organic erosion replaced by sharp, unnatural angles. Rivers flowed in perfectly straight lines for miles, ignoring the natural contours of the land, their banks defined by abrupt, unyielding edges. The world was reorganizing itself, aligning to some unseen, fundamental blueprint. My hands trembled as I scrolled, a frantic energy coursing through me. I was right. I was terrified. The broadcast channels, usually so eager to sensationalize, were growing quiet, their anchors visibly unnerved. Then came the reports of the burial mound opened for first time in millennia. This wasn't some remote anomaly. It was a globally significant archaeological discovery, a place of immense historical weight. It was being televised, live, for the entire world to see. I watched, transfixed, as the camera panned over the ancient site. The air around the excavated chamber shimmered, not with heat, but with something else, something that made the images on my screen waver. The archaeologists, a team of seasoned professionals, moved with an almost dreamlike slowness. Their voices, usually sharp with excitement, were flat, distant. The ground itself, disturbed for the first time in countless ages, was not what it should have been. The earth exposed to the air was not crumbling soil or ancient stone. It was smooth, unnervingly so, a surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was too perfect. A colleague, an anthropologist, was being interviewed near the site. Her face, usually so animated, was slack, her eyes wide and unfocused. She spoke of the impossible precision of the ancient carvings, not just intricate, but perfectly geometric, defying any known ancient tools or techniques. As she spoke, her words seemed to fray, her sentences losing their cohesion. She paused mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on something beyond the camera's view. Then he was gone. Not a fade, not a collapse, just gone. One moment he was there, framed by the impossible smoothness of the earth. The next, the space she occupied was empty. The camera didn't jerk. The interviewer didn't react immediately. It was as if no one had noticed. A collective, global amnesia settled over the broadcast. The interviewer continued, asking a question to the empty space, waiting for a response that would never come. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I stared at the screen, at the empty space where he had been. The burial mound, opened for first time in millennia, wasn't just showing geometric impossibilities. It was consuming people. It was erasing them. The feed continued, oblivious. Other excavators moved with the same slow, dazed steps. A shovel clattered to the ground, but no one bent to retrieve it. A geologist, examining a rock face, seemed to dissolve, his form blurring at the edges before simply ceasing to be. No one screamed. No one reacted. This wasn't just my sanity unraveling. This was everything. This was the correction. This was the cosmic entity making its presence undeniably known, not through a signal, but by rewriting reality itself. What did it want to make of us? The silence had become a predator. It stalked me through my apartment, through the empty streets, a vast, echoing void that marked my every thought. They had suspended me, locked me out of the observatory, out of the data, out of the very means to prove what I knew. My colleagues, once eager collaborators, now saw only a man unraveling, a mind shattered by the very cosmos he sought to understand. They spoke of rest, of distance, of perspective. They didn't know the perspective I already had, but they hadn't taken everything. A phantom resonance, a subtle vibration that hummed just beneath the surface of reality, guiding me. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but a certainty that pulsed in my skull, a magnetic pull toward something ancient, something buried. My body was a husk, fueled by caffeine and a frantic, almost manic clarity that allowed me to see connections no sane mind would dare to make. My hands trembled constantly, not from fear, but from the sheer volume of information my brain was processing, every nerve alight. The coordinates led me to a remote, desolate stretch of land, far from any paved road. There, nestled amongst ancient, twisted trees, was the entrance to a burial mound opened for first time in millennia. A raw, jagged gash in the earth, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, framed by timbers so old they had turned to stone. This was it. This was where the signal had been pointing, not to a receiver, but to a resonance chamber. I dropped to my knees, pushing aside crumbling debris, and squeezed through the opening. The air inside was still, heavy, and tasted of dust and something else, something like ozone and distant lightning. The passage narrowed, the rough-hewn walls pressing in, scraping against my shoulders. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sound in the profound quiet. I could feel the weight of countless centuries above me, crushing down. The tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. My flashlight beam danced over walls carved with crude, geometric patterns, spirals and angles that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of my vision. This was no ordinary tomb. The carvings weren't decorative. They were a language, a desperate attempt by ancient minds to record something utterly alien. My eyes traced the lines, my hyper-awareness allowing me to perceive the subtle irregularities, the almost imperceptible deviations from Euclidean geometry embedded within the patterns. My vision swam. Then, the true vision began. It wasn't an image appearing before me, but a complete restructuring of how I perceived reality. The air in the chamber thickened, solidifying into impossible angles that weren't visible but felt. My eyes tried to focus, but there was nothing to focus on, only the sensation of space itself tearing, reknitting itself into configurations that defied explanation. The walls were no longer walls. They were surfaces that bent inward and outward simultaneously, collapsing and expanding without moving. It wasn't a form I could delineate, no head, no limbs, no discernible body. It was a principle made manifest, a shifting, impossible geometry that occupied the space, yet existed beyond it. It was a series of overlapping realities, each one subtly different, like a million reflections in fractured glass, except the glass was my own mind. I saw the chamber not as a single room, but as an infinite series of nested chambers, each one slightly askew, each one vibrating with a different frequency of impossible light. My stomach churned. And then, the understanding. It didn't come as words or a thought, but as a pure, distilled knowing, born from the impossible vision. The entity wasn't here to destroy, not in the way we understood it. It was here to correct, to reshape existence, to smooth out the imperfections it perceived in our reality, our physics, our very concept of space and time. It saw our universe as flawed, a chaotic, inefficient mess that needed to be brought into alignment with its own alien logic. The spirals on the wall weren't warnings, they were blueprints. Blueprints for a universe utterly alien, utterly perfect, in its own incomprehensible way. Our existence, our laws, our very being, were simply anomalies to be rectified. And it was happening. I could feel the subtle shift in the air, the faint hum in the stone, the slow, agonizing process of reality itself being rethreaded, unspooled and rewoven into something utterly unrecognizable. How much of this correction had already taken place, imperceptible to all but a shattered mind like mine. My apartment felt like a tomb. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight, oblivious. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, was a frantic hive, buzzing with fragmented memories. A discarded report. A hushed conversation in the break room weeks ago before the signal consumed me. A geoarchaeology team working on a remote site had flagged an anomalous energy signature. Dismissed as geological interference, forgotten amidst the clamor of the cosmic revelation. But now it clicked. The location, the description of the site, a deep, ancient disturbance. The coordinates were etched into my memory, a phantom pain behind my eyes. I had to go. No one else would. No one else could see. My hands trembled as I packed a small bag. Water, some dried fruit, a battered flashlight. My car, usually a reliable extension of my will, felt sluggish, protesting the journey. The engine coughed, then caught, a grumbling complaint against the encroaching stillness. The drive was a blur of highway and increasingly desolate backroads. The sky, usually a vibrant canvas, seemed muted, a flat, uniform gray that pressed down on the landscape. Trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their leaves barely rustling in the absent wind. I saw no other vehicles, no distant lights, only the endless, winding asphalt unspooling before me. My breath plumed in front of me, visible proof of my own fragile existence. Hours later, the road dwindled to a dirt track, then a barely discernible path overgrown with scrub. The flashlight beam cut a meager swat through the deepening twilight. The ground underfoot was uneven, littered with loose stones that shifted and rolled, threatening my balance. My muscles ached, but a frantic urgency propelled me forward. I felt a pull, a magnetic draw, not of the earth, but of something deeper, something far older than geology. And then I saw it. Around its base, the raw, disturbed earth marked the site of the dig. A skeletal structure of scaffolding, half-collapsed, stood like a monument to abandoned effort. This was it. The burial mound opened for first time in millennia. The air here was different, heavy, stagnant. It tasted of dust and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the accompanying storm. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor vibrated through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the ground shaking, it was the air itself, humming with an unheard frequency. I reached the lip of the trench, but what lay at the very bottom in the exposed core stole my breath. It wasn't an artifact. It wasn't a chamber. It was a patch of absolute, light-absorbing blackness, perfectly circular, about 10 feet across. It didn't reflect the beam of my flashlight. It swallowed it. It was not a hole in the ground, but a hole of the ground, an absence that defied dimension. As I stared, transfixed, the subtle shifts began. The gray sky above me deepened, not to night, but to a color I had no name for, a bruised purple that pulsed with an internal, unseen light. The distant hills, once a solid, familiar outline, seemed to waver, their edges blurring, then sharpening into impassable angles. Then the world changed. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sigh, a vast, cosmic exhalation. The ground beneath my feet no longer felt solid. It rippled, like water under a gentle breeze, but without fluidity. The texture of the soil, the rough bark of a nearby scrub brush, the smooth surface of a stone I gripped, they all began to subtly alter. My fingers traced patterns on the stone that weren't there a moment before, intricate, alien filigrees that seemed to grow and recede under my touch. The air became viscous, resisting my movements. Each breath was an effort, like drawing in thick syrup. I looked up. The sky was no longer bruised purple. It was a shimmering tapestry of colors that had no place in the visible spectrum. They bled into each other, forming impassable gradients, then coalesced into sharp, geometric forms that drifted across the expanse. These forms were not clouds. They were structures, vast and silent, shifting with an incomprehensible geometry. They were there, yet they felt like impressions on my retina, not tangible objects in space. My gaze fell back to the distant town, a cluster of lights I had passed hours ago. They were still there, but they too were changing. They still stood, but they were no longer human structures. They were monuments to an alien calculus, rearranged, reordered. A scream built in my throat, but it never escaped. My muscles spasmed, my vision swam. I could feel the transformation in my own body, a deep, unsettling hum in my bones. My skin felt alien, too tight then too loose. My mind rebelled, trying to impose logic on the impossible, but logic itself was unraveling. The world was being rewritten, not destroyed, but corrected. Corrected into something utterly indifferent, utterly alien, utterly wrong. What had become of the people, of the world I knew? Had they simply ceased to be, folded into this new, incomprehensible tapestry? Or were they still here, transformed beyond recognition, existing in a reality I could no longer perceive, no longer inhabit? It resonated in my bones, a deep, knowing thrum that defied their dismissals. I was locked out of the future, but the past remained. My determination was a raw, burning ember in my chest. I spent days in the hushed, forgotten corners of the university library, surrounded by the scent of decaying paper and dust, sifting through arcane texts, obscure archaeological reports, and geological surveys. I wasn't looking for another signal. I was looking for an echo, a historical reverberation of what I had heard. It was a footnote, buried deep in a crumbling monograph on prehistoric earthworks, a brief mention of a geological anomaly, a localized distortion in magnetic fields, coinciding with what ancient texts described as a rupture in the firmament. The location was remote, in a desolate, forgotten corner of the world, far from any modern settlement, a place of forgotten things. The journey was a blur of bus rides, a rattling train, and finally, a rented, battered utility vehicle that groaned over rutted, unpaved tracks. The air grew thin, sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid, like ozone after a storm that never broke. My vision blurred at the edges. This was the burial mound opened for first time in millennia. Its entrance, a crude archway carved from megalithic stones, gaped like a mouth in the earth. No sign, no marker, just the raw, silent invitation of ancient stone. The air around the entrance felt thick, heavy, pressing down on my eardrums. I could taste dust and something else, something bitter and ancient on my tongue. I hesitated, a hand gripping the worn fabric of my jacket. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the signal still hummed. I had to know. I stepped inside. My cheap flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling path, revealing walls of rough-hewn stone, wet with an ancient, clinging dampness. Each breath caught in my chest, a shallow, desperate gasp. The passageway sloped downwards, narrowing, the ceiling pressing closer, forcing me to hunch. The tunnel opened into a vast, circular chamber. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing carvings, not of human figures or animals, but of impossible geometries, lines that bent and twisted in ways that defied Euclidean space, shapes that seemed to shift and reform at the periphery of my vision. The stone itself seemed to ripple. In the center of the chamber stood an altar not of stone, but of a material I could not name. As I drew closer, a low hum began, not from within me, but from the altar itself, a resonant frequency that vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my legs, into my very skull. It was the signal. Here, now. And then I saw the truth. The altar was covered in symbols, etched not into the surface, but through it, as if the material itself had been unmade and rewoven. These weren't carvings, they were fundamental alterations to existence. My gaze snagged on one symbol, a swirling vortex of lines that should not be able to exist in 3 dimensions. As I stared, the lines separated, each strand a thread of something incomprehensible, something that was, and was not, simultaneously. The air shimmered. My vision flickered like a faulty projector. The walls of the chamber began to warp. The impossible geometries on the stone twisted, no longer static, but flowing like liquid. The very concept of wall seemed to fray, dissolving into a shimmering haze. The hum intensified, a silent scream that tore at the edges of my sanity. The entity wasn't a distant signal, a future threat. It was here, it had always been here. The burial mound opened for first time in millennia wasn't a discovery. It was a reopening, a place where the veil had thinned before, where the corrections had been made. The impossible geometries, the shifting reality, these weren't ancient warnings, but evidence, proof that the very laws of existence, the constants I had built my life upon, were mutable. They had been subtly, relentlessly corrected for millennia. My mind splintered. The colors of the cave inverted, then melted into shades I had never known existed. My own hands, held before my face, seemed to stretch and contract, the skin rippling like disturbed water, revealing impassable bone structures beneath. The hum was everywhere, inside me, outside me, an omnipresent truth. I was no longer Marcus. I was a collection of fragmented perceptions, a fleeting echo in a universe that had never truly been what I thought it was. The entity wasn't unraveling reality. It was revealing its true, fluid, incomprehensible nature. What was the shape of a thought when gravity itself became a suggestion?